Hello and welcome to the Be Ready for the World conference. I'm Becky from Cambridge University Press and I'll be hosting your webinar today. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Karen Angus-Cole, who will take you through this session on the what, how and why of assessment for learning. Karen is an education consultant and lecturer in education at the University of Bath in the UK. Before we start, I just wanted to go through a few points with you. You may have noticed your microphones are muted. They will stay on mute as we go through the session to avoid any background noise. Karen and I are also both hosting this webinar from home, so if there are any issues with our internet connections, please bear with us. There will be a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so do post any questions you'd like to ask in the Q&A box as we go through. Please don't put any of those questions in the chat box as they can sometimes get a bit lost. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or video, please let us know in the chat and we'll do our best to resolve them. We recommend that you use headphones to listen to this session for the best sound quality. We are recording the webinar and we'll send you a link to the playlist following the conference, so don't worry if you miss anything. If you're unable to see the Q&A or the chat icons, please hover your mouse at the bottom or the top of the screen and they should appear. And now, over to Karen.
Great, thank you, Becky. Hello, everyone. I hope you're well today. Let's begin talking about assessment for learning, the what, why, and how. So here's a familiar sight, a picture of a classroom with students listening to their teacher, and the teacher is explaining something to these learners. But then the teacher starts to think, I've just been teaching, but are my students learning? Does teaching lead to learning? This is a key question for us as teachers. When we're teaching in our classrooms, are our students learning? And this important question can be addressed by thinking about how we use assessment for learning in our classrooms. So what are we going to cover in this session today? We're going to look at what is assessment for learning, which will abbreviate to AFL. We'll also think about why might I want to use AFL in my classroom. And then we'll also think about how can I implement assessment for learning. In the first part of this webinar, we're going to look at the first two questions. What is assessment for learning and why might I use it? And then we'll have a pause and we'll have an opportunity for you to ask any questions, see what's come up in the Q&A session. And then we'll address the last part of the webinar, how can I implement AFL? So to understand what assessment for learning is and why we might use it, we're going to consider three questions. And these three questions can be returned to again and again throughout your teaching, in a lesson, in a unit, in a year of study, and they're also transferable between educational contexts, between subjects, year groups, countries, and so hopefully you'll find them useful for your own practice. So question number one. This question is, where is the learner going? And so we need to think about what do our learners need to understand, to know, and be able to do by the end of a sequence of learning, for example, a lesson or a unit, a year, or even the whole course. And it's important that you don't keep this a secret, that this isn't just something that the teacher themselves knows. It's important to share this with your learners, not keeping them in the dark. Why? Well, by sharing our learning intentions and success criteria with our students, teachers and learners can have a clear and shared understanding of what needs to be achieved in order to show success. One word of caution though, do check that learners understand the aims, the intentions, the success criteria. Sometimes we, as teachers, can use learning intentions and success criteria that seem quite abstract for our learners, and we might use terminology that they don't really understand. If we take time to share the learning intentions and success criteria and check that our students understand them, then everybody understands the journey, the destination, and everything becomes transparent for everyone who is involved in the learning process. So this brings us to question number 2. If we know where we want learners to go, which was question number 1, the second question is, where is the learner now? How close are they to reaching the learning intentions? How far are they from reaching the learning intentions? And we need to find out the answer to this question quite regularly. Why? Well, by regularly assessing where your learners are, you can find out what they have accomplished, what they can do, and what they're still struggling with. An even better approach is if your learners can themselves reflect against the learning intentions and success criteria. They can reflect on their progress and they can start to think about whether they have met the learning intentions. This is another benefit of the learners themselves understanding what the learning intentions and success criteria are, so that they can develop these reflective skills. So this now brings us to question number 3. We know where the learners are going, which was question number 1, and we know where the learners are now, which was question number 2. So we now ask, how can the learner get there? How can the learner get to meet the learning intentions from where they are at this point in their learning? What should the next steps be for the learner? What could you do? What could your learners do to get closer to meeting the learning intentions? Why do we need to do this? Well, the evidence that you can gather helps you to make choices in your teaching and to be responsive to your learners' needs. It helps you as a teacher to develop and choose appropriate activities and provide feedback that is going to take your learners from where they are at that point in their learning to the next stage to get closer to the learning intentions. And so this feedback is about helping students to progress from where they currently are. So in summary, when we're trying to understand what assessment for learning is and why we might use it, we've looked at 3 key questions that can scaffold our thinking. The first is, where is the learner going? The second is, where is the learner now? And the third is, how can the learner get there? And these exist in a process, in a cycle. We need to know where the learner's going, we find out where the learner is now, and then that helps us to determine how the learner can get there. Oops. So this cycle is the process of assessment for learning. So we can therefore think about asking the question, what is assessment for learning? We can define it as an integrated teaching approach that elicits information about where learners are in their learning, so that feedback can be provided that continues to move learning forwards. And why? To summarise why we might implement assessment for learning. Our assessment approaches then become integrated with our teaching rather than being an add-on. And this supports the achievement of learners to get to the learning intentions. Learners therefore make more progress. And actually, learners can be empowered to direct their own learning. So at this point, I just want to pause because we've looked at the what and the why. I want to know if there are any questions that have come up in the chat that we can answer at the moment. Becky, is there anything that we can look at now?
Hi, Karen. Not just yet, but you've given us such a lot of great information there. It might just take a while for people to gather their thoughts and think of a question. So whilst they do that, I wondered if I could ask you something, which is that often when I speak to teachers, they will ask me about formative assessment. I just wondered if you could explain a little bit about what the difference is between assessment for learning and formative assessment.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks, Becky. We can often have teachers asking a similar question. So I would say that assessment for learning is the process that we go through in the classroom to think about those 3 questions that we've just looked at. Where is the learner going? Where are they now? And how are they going to get there? Whereas the formative assessment is the purpose of the assessment. So it's more of an adjective. We decide that we're going to do some assessment, Is it going to be formative? Are students going to be finding out where they are in their learning? Are they going to get feedback that moves them forward? Or alternatively, the other assessment type is summative assessment. Now, summative assessment tends to be when we're assessing a student, how far they've come, what they've actually learnt, and then usually it involves giving a grade. So maybe if we think about the A-levels or IGCSEs, for example, that would be summative assessment. However, we may have some assessments which could be both summative and formative. So if a student does an in-class test, and that is summative because they get a grade for that test, but if feedback is also provided and students learn from that process, it becomes a formative piece of assessment as well. So in summary, formative will be the purpose, whereas assessment for learning is the actual process of going through in the classroom, asking yourself those questions as a teacher.
Oh, great. Thanks, Karen. That's a really nice, easy way to remember process and purpose. Thank you. We have now had a few interesting questions come in, so I'll choose some of these to ask you now before we move on. Abdul has asked what the difference is between assessment for learning and the learning objectives. Could you speak a bit about the relationship between those two, perhaps?
Yeah, so we can kind of think of it in terms of sort of backwards design. So we start off thinking when we're planning our lessons, what do we need our learners to know? What do we need them to be able to understand? What do we need them to be able to do? And you may get this from your specification content, for example, from the syllabus, from the curriculum. But that's what drives what you're going to do in the classroom, because we know that that's where we need to get students to. So those learning objectives are the key thing that you need to think about before you do any planning of your lesson. And then you need to think about, right, if students meet those learning objectives, how will I know? What evidence will I be able to gather from them that shows me that they've met those learning objectives or those learning intentions? And that might become a bit clearer in the second half of the webinar, where I give some more concrete examples of how you can link learning objectives to different assessment for learning approaches. So hopefully that will help to answer as well.
That's great, Karen. I think I'll just ask one more from the Q&A here, and there are lots now coming in that we will get to at the end of Karen's session. But there's an interesting one here from Rania that asks, assessment as learning and assessment for learning, what's the difference? It's an interesting one.
Yeah, a really great question. So yeah, definitely that is something that is coming up in sort of pedagogical literature at the moment. So assessment as learning often refers to students themselves becoming the assessors. So things like self-assessment, things like peer assessment. And so they are going through the process of assessing work themselves to learn from that process. I can refer to that a little bit later on as well in some of the activities that I share as practical ways in which you can embed assessment for learning. So I would say that assessment as learning is kind of a type of assessment for learning where it's really student focused and it's developing reflective capacity and things like metacognition as well.
Great, thanks, Karen. I think we can carry on and we'll pick up some of your great questions coming in at the end of the session. Thanks, Karen.
Great, perfect. Thanks, Becky. So let's just return back to this image which we looked at right at the start of this webinar and think about AFL allowing us to think about learners learning as a consequence of our teaching. So we asked this question, we raised this at the start of the webinar, does teaching lead to learning? And so by thinking about assessment for learning, we can really start to answer that question. Is our teaching leading to learning in the classroom? How might we do that? We've looked at what assessment for learning might be, why we might do it, thinking about learners' progress, but how do you actually go about doing that in the classroom practically? And before I go and share some ideas, I want you to think about your own practice for a few moments. So I want you to reflect, and I want you to spend a few moments reflecting on your own practice, your own context, your own students, and I want you to think about the 3 assessment for learning questions. How do you clarify where your learners are going? How do you find out where your learners are in their learning? And when and how often do you do this? And how do you respond to the information that you get about your learners learning? So we're going to have a bit of silence for just a few seconds just to allow you to actually take some time and reflect on your own practice in relation to these assessment for learning process questions. Okay, so when we think about embedding assessment for learning in our teaching, we have to recognise that you, the teacher, play an important role in the classroom, an incredibly important role. You teach, but you can incorporate assessment for learning into your teaching, and you can respond to that information that you gather by embedding assessment for learning, by adapting your teaching, having your teaching informed by the results of the assessment for learning process to help you to maximise your students' learning. And we can incorporate assessment for learning cycles regularly into our teaching. We can do some teaching, we can embed some assessment for learning. That informs our next steps for our teaching. We can do some more assessment for learning, etc., etc. And so the regular incorporation of these assessment for learning cycles can be over a longer period of time, it can be over a shorter period of time, it can be across a lesson, it could be you embed it throughout a unit, you think about how often you're embedding assessment for learning in a year of study or even the whole course. And the key idea is that you keep finding out where your students are in their learning. Is your teaching leading to learning? Where are your students now? Where are they now after more teaching has happened? Where are they now after even more lessons have happened? What scaffolding do your students need to move forward in their learning and actually meet those learning intentions? However, with this repeated assessment, we do not mean that you should be giving your students written tests all of the time to assess their learning. There are many, many different ways that you can embed assessment for learning into your lessons to support your students to reach the learning intentions without always having to give formal written tests. So I'm going to go through a few examples now of how you might embed assessment for learning into your lessons. The first one that we're going to discuss is circulating and questioning. So circulating just means moving around the classroom, not just staying at the front, but moving amongst your learners. And doing this can be really, really powerful in terms of allowing you to find out where your learners are in their learning. So for example, you might ask your learners a question that is related to the learning intentions. So this will allow you to work out how close to meeting the learning intentions your students are. And it may be that you ask a question to the whole class, but then you allow the students to discuss the learners with one another, discuss the answer, with one another. And as the learners are discussing their answer to the question that you've asked, you can walk around the classroom and you can listen to their discussions and their answers. And that gives you information about the learner's progress based on the answers that you can hear whilst you're walking around. And also, whilst you're circulating, you're able to stop and talk to certain groups or individual students and provide them with immediate oral feedback, and that will let them know how well they're doing. So you may correct them, you may praise them, you may give them some indication that they're along the right lines and give them some hints. And so it can be a really quick way for students to get feedback on their answers without necessarily having to put their hand up in front of the whole class when maybe they might be shy and not want to speak out in front of the rest of the class. So let's give a concrete example of how this might be done. Imagine that you were teaching a science lesson and the learning intention was to explain how plants absorb water from the soil. So for example, by the end of this lesson, you wanted all of your learners to be able to explain how plants absorb water from the soil. And you may have done a short introduction, a short explanation, but now you want to check that your students can actually explain the process. So you ask them the question, how do plants absorb water from the soil? And you allow them to discuss with one another, and you start walking around the classroom. And as you're walking around the classroom, you hear a student say, it passes across a cell membrane. Now, you can intervene and you can give feedback, and you can ask the student, what do you mean by it? It passes across a cell membrane. What is it? You can also ask them which cell membrane are they talking about? And you can also ask them which process, which transport process are they talking about? Now, you could do this as a whole class discussion as well, but remember that there are benefits to students interacting with one another and incorporating active learning, for example. So the results of the walk around the classroom after asking the question might indicate that many students understand, or many students are struggling to explain a concept. And so depending on the outcome, you may choose to set a different activity to that which you had actually planned. And that will help your students move from where they are now towards the learning intentions. And this is responsive teaching. It will help the students to get to where they need to go. And it helps them to get there from where they are now. And this is good teaching. It is not bad because you've diverged from the lesson plan. It is responsive teaching that helps to meet the needs of the learners in front of you. So here's another example of how we can embed assessment for learning approaches into our classroom. This is called whole class hinge questions. Now, a whole class hinge question is a question that is asked to the whole class, and it's a quick question that learners answer, normally individually, and its aim is to determine whether all learners in the classroom understand a particular fact, not piece of knowledge, a particular skill, something that is related to the learning intentions. Are all the learners there yet? And the question has to have a correct answer or an incorrect answer. And if you find that the students are answering correctly, then perhaps you can move on and stretch and challenge them by asking a more difficult question, setting a different and more challenging activity. Or it might be that you're happy that this part of the lesson, all of the students have met the learning intention for that part of the lesson. And so you can move on to the next part, confidently knowing that your learners have met the learning intention. If students answer incorrectly, then you can clarify misconceptions. You might give them a different activity to do. You can also pair learners, so those which got the answer correct with those that got the answer incorrect, and peer learning can occur where they can learn from one another. So one of the key things is that this whole class hinge question should be really quick for the students to answer. But the important part is that you give learners thinking time. So you may pose the question, and then you may wait for 30 seconds. The students think on their own, and then they come up with their answer to your question. Every single student in the classroom is expected to come up with the answer to the question. And it should be really quick for you to scan the students' responses, and we'll look shortly at how they might indicate their responses to you. And so because it's quick for you to scan the responses of your students, you can quickly make a decision about what to do next in your classroom. Where are your students? How close are they to the learning intentions based on the answers that have been given? And so what are you going to do next to help them to move further on with their learning? So how could they respond to you? How can you get all of the students in the class responding all at the same time? You could have them answering questions which are true or false. So thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false, or other options where you have 3 potential answers to a question and each answer is represented by thumbs up, thumbs down, or thumbs in the middle. You could also have questions which are multiple choice, and so students can quickly indicate a letter rather than having to write out a lot of information, and they can do this by maybe posting in a chat if you're teaching online, or on a whiteboard, which we'll talk about in a second if they hold up a mini whiteboard. You can add numbers to answers to questions, or your question answer might actually be a number itself, and students can indicate what they think about the answer by indicating through their fingers. If you are online, You can use emojis that could come up in the chat. So students can either indicate how confident they feel about a particular part of what you're teaching, maybe with a smiley face, a sad face if they're not too happy with it and would like to spend more time in the lesson going over it. And then mini whiteboards. So this can be really useful if, rather than having a multiple choice question, you have students write down one particular word or a couple of words answers or a symbol, or they draw a shape, for example, and they can do this and then they can show their whiteboards. However, one of the really key things here is that you want students to have thinking time and then to all show their responses to you at the same time so that they're not influenced by each other's answers. So you need to get your students to think on their own, and then you need to give a signal when you want them to all respond at the same time and set the expectation that every single student should be responding so that you can get an understanding of where all of the students in your class are at one particular point. So let's look at a concrete example again. So in this example, we've got a maths question. What is the product of 5 and 3? And again, you can have a correct answer, which would be a learner who might write 15 on a mini whiteboard if they were able to just write down their answer, and that would be correct. If a learner writes an incorrect answer, this could give you more information about any misconceptions that they might have. For example, if they wrote 8 on their mini whiteboard and showed this, then it means that they added rather than multiplied. This was a quick to answer question, but the teacher gave learners thinking time. They quickly scanned the mini whiteboards looking for the responses, and then they quickly made a decision about what to do next. So in this scenario, if there were only a small number of students who had got the answer incorrect, perhaps the teacher sets an activity for those who got the answer right, and then works in a small group with those students who got the answer wrong and gives them a bit more support to understand what it means when we need to find a product of two numbers. This is the responsive teaching, responding to the needs of the learners in the classroom. Maybe they hadn't planned for some students to get the answer incorrect, but they respond and recognise that some students need a bit more support to understand the product. So again, assessment for learning has been used to find out where the learners are in their learning and provide feedback and adapt teaching so that all learners can move forward and meet the learning intentions. The teaching is always being informed by the information that the teacher is getting by doing the assessment for learning and embedding it within the teaching so that feedback can be given as quickly as possible so that any misconceptions, any misunderstandings can be clarified, can be corrected as quickly as possible. Some of you may have come across this. This is a framework from Dylan William, an assessment for learning framework, and it shows the importance of the 3 questions, thinking about where the learner is going, where the learner currently is, and how they're going to get there. But you can see that there are 3 roles in the classroom in this particular framework. The first is the teacher, but then there is also a peer, and there is also the learner. And we can see that in the row for the teacher, it's really important that the teacher is able to engineer effective discussions, tasks, and activities to elicit evidence of learning. It's also important that the teacher provides feedback that moves learners forward. But if, going back to what we spoke about at the start, if everybody in the classroom has a good understanding of the learning intentions and a shared understanding, we can actually start to use peers and learners as great resources, learning resources for one another in the classroom. Peers can provide feedback, they can help their peers to find out where they are in their learning and how they might get there. And also, students can be activated as owners of their own learning, and so they can self-assess their work. And this can be really, really powerful, but it will only work if everybody has a shared understanding of the learning intentions. So how could this work in practice? 2-stage tests is one potential example. So you could have learners who complete a short test. It could be a really informal test, and they could do that individually. They could self-assess against a mark scheme, for example. Or what you could do instead is actually get learners to complete the same test in a group with only one test paper immediately after they conducted the individual test. This is a really great way to get students to interact with one another, to learn with one another, to provide feedback for one another. It's a really engaging and motivating way for students to be at the centre of their learning, to get feedback from peers quickly, to engage in discussion. And what they have to do is decide together on the answer that they think is the most appropriate. And so this is a really, really beneficial way of using peers to move learning forward in a classroom so that students are working together and helping each other with their learning. And just before we finish, I want to think about the scales of AFL. An aspect of assessment for learning to remember is that it can take a range of formats. It could be quite informal, such as circulating and questioning, or it could be more formal, such as an in-class test, where learners then self-assess using a mark scheme, and then you still take in the marks. So this would be an example of something that was formative and summative, and an example of assessment as learning if the learners are doing self-assessment. Assessment for learning can also occur over different periods of time. It's not necessarily just suited to within one lesson over short term. It could occur over a longer period. So we need to remember that learning can be, or is, a longer term process. Just because students appear to have not or to have learnt something in a lesson, it doesn't mean that in 1 month, 2 months, a year's time, that learning will still be there. It can take a long time for what we understand to transition into our longer term memory. So we need to provide opportunities for students to reinforce knowledge and understanding. And we need to check what they are retaining as well, what skills, what knowledge, what understanding they're retaining over a longer period of time. So for example, in-class questioning is quite short term. It's in the actual lesson and it's quite informal. It's quite, it involves the teachers interacting with students quite informally. That's not a written test. It's not under timed conditions. If we look at an end of topic test, that's over a longer period of time. And if we give feedback with that test, rather than just marking it and giving it a grade, then it becomes a bit more, it's more formal. Students tend to sit them individually under silent conditions. But if feedback is provided through self-assessment or peer marking, or if you provide feedback to the whole class on how they did and focus on particular questions that they may have struggled with, or you give individual feedback, that becomes assessment for learning rather than just an assessment of learning. And it is less short term because it's over a longer period of time. And then maybe you might have end of year learning summaries, which will be more longer term. So it's your turn to reflect again now based on what we've discussed this afternoon. I want you to think again about your own practice. I want you to think about what you already do, but what more could you do? What tweaks could you make to your practice? How could you clarify where your learners are going? How could you find out where your learners are at in their learning? And when and how often could you do this? And how could you respond to the information you get about your learners' learning? So I'll just give you a few moments to think about those questions now and reflect back on what we've discussed this afternoon. So just to summarise what we've covered together in this session, we've thought about what assessment for learning is, why we might want to use it in our classroom, and how we can implement AFL in our classrooms as well. And I hope that you've got some practical strategies that will help you to embed AFL into your classroom practice as soon as you teach again. I want to say thank you. And in line with the whole assessment for learning process and the idea of getting feedback to improve and move forward, if you have any feedback, that's always gratefully received. And Becky, we can return back and see if there are any more questions that have come up.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for that. That was really clear. And I love how you unpacked, as you mentioned at the start, the process of assessment for learning there. We've had some great comments coming in saying that you're offering some really nice strategies. It's a really excellent presentation. So hopefully people have enjoyed it and found it useful. We have had a lot of great questions, actually, and I've been trying to organize them into some themes to tackle because there are some common threads coming out there. I think I'll perhaps start with what I think will probably be quite a quick question, which is there a difference between learning intentions and learning objectives?
So learning intentions is kind of what you intend students to learn. We would say that tends to be now what we are calling what used to be learning objectives. Objectives is what you want students to learn as well. But the idea around intention is that it's what we intend. We're not necessarily sure whether students are going to get there. And so it gives us that idea that this is what we want in an ideal world. And I think it allows us to remember that not everybody is going to get to a particular place by the end of a lesson, by the end of a unit. And so there's not a huge amount of difference between an objective and an intention, but I think it helps to reframe how we think about our students' learning, and that we're careful about assuming that they're going to get to a particular place by the end of a lesson. So it encourages us to be reflective when we set those learning intentions, what we intend, what we really hope our students will learn by the end of the period that we've set those intentions for.
Great, thank you. That actually leads me on to another question that a few people have asked about actually in the Q&A, and I think it links to your points around being responsive as a teacher. A few people have asked about how closely linked assessment for learning and differentiated teaching are, and what that relationship is between those two. Could you perhaps say a little bit more about differentiation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So assessment for learning definitely allows you to bring differentiation into your classroom. So for example, if we imagine the really extreme situation where we have a teacher who teaches at the front of the classroom and kind of lectures to their students, there's no opportunity there to find out what the students have learned. It's the same teaching approach for every single student in the classroom. Whereas if we have assessment for learning, it brings in the ability to differentiate, to respond to individual students' needs, to group students together, as one of the examples I gave. So every student doesn't have to be doing exactly the same thing in the classroom all of the time, because everybody will be learning and making progress at different levels. And that is what differentiation is. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to print off 10, 15 different worksheets. It could be that you could ask a different question to a different learner. You may ask a question in a different way whilst you're circulating. When you're circulating, you may know that some students are struggling with a topic. And so that allows you to then think, oh, hold on, I'll go to them first whilst I'm walking around the classroom. I'll then interact with them, and then I'll move around to other students who I know are already quite secure in their knowledge in this area. So it does allow us to differentiate quite well in the classroom by bringing in assessment for learning and thinking very, very regularly about where each of our students is in their learning.
Great, thank you, Karen. On that point, I suppose, around it being a student-centred approach, we had a couple of questions that came in. Praneet and Isabel asked questions along these lines about how you can improve student engagement and involvement in this process. Assessment for learning is a particular relationship between the teacher and student, isn't it? That's very dynamic. And I think a really interesting point that Isabel raised is, how do you help students to not feel scared, is actually the phrase she used, about showing what they might know or might not feel comfortable with? Do you have any tips for how to bring students in a confident way?
It's a really great question, because at the heart of assessment for learning is a really positive learning environment. Your classroom must be positive. Students must feel able to talk to one another. They must feel able to talk to you. And so you have to develop a culture as soon as you interact with your students. You have to welcome them. You have to make them feel like they are in a safe environment. Smile, ask them questions, find out what they like, try to bring that into your lessons. All of this relationship building is really key. be really clear as well. It is your chance to talk now to one another. That is okay. If that's not something that you've done in your classroom before, then be really explicit and say that you can talk to one another now. I will be walking around because I want to help you and I want to hear the things that you're saying so that I can help you and let you know if you've got it right, if you are on the right lines, or if I can help you in any way to move further forward or correct any misunderstandings. And the words we use, misunderstanding rather than something you've got completely wrong, can make a real difference to the way in which students perceive the opportunities that can come from these interactions with one another and with the teachers, so that they can actually see learning, that progress in their learning, so they can feel positive and confident about actually engaging. And it won't happen overnight. I'm not saying you can suddenly just go in and do peer assessment and self-assessment overnight and the students won't know what's happening. It'll have to be gradual. So just maybe, I guess I'd say, think of one or two things that you might take back to your classroom, that you might start doing, and just be really clear with the students about what you're doing and also why you're doing it. And we all know why we're doing it, because we want them to make as much progress as possible and enjoy their learning.
That's great. I think you mentioned how important feedback is as part of this process. And we've had a few questions. I think it's probably been the number one question actually is, of course, in the world that we're living in situations where teachers are needing to do remote teaching and they've got children or learners on another side of a screen. Are there any parts of advice that you could offer around how this is manageable in a remote teaching context? So feedback is a prime example, of course. How do you keep that going and make sure that students are responding to feedback, taking in feedback when we have the obstacles that we do at the moment? How do you think that the current situation impacts the successful implementation of AFL?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we have to be clear that feedback can take many forms. So it's not just marking, even just asking questions, even getting students' responses and then responding to their responses. So for example, if you ask a question and students put things in the chat, you can pull things out and start to talk to the whole class about the things that are strong, which are strengths in the answers, and areas that might need improving. Breakout rooms are really great ways to still allow students to be able to interact with one another, and you can ask maybe one student to feed back to the whole class out of the group that are in the breakout rooms, so that you can ensure that productive discussions are still going on in a breakout room, because I know it can feel weird sending your students off and not really being able to see what they're doing, which doesn't happen in the classroom. You can quickly cast your eye and see across the whole room what's going on. So I think that's really important in terms of accountability, but it also, breakout rooms really help with those discussions, which can help with peer feedback. And even just giving students the opportunity to ask questions themselves. And it may be that they can do this anonymously. So if they don't want to be really visible, you can set up Google documents where students can anonymously enter questions, I still don't understand this. So there are many ways, but really simply, I tend to just use the chat, breakout rooms, and then shared documents or things like Padlet, where students can anonymously just post questions or worries that they might have, or even asking them, how have you responded to this feedback? And then getting them to post answers to that question. So being really explicit about it. And I think one of the advantages is that it can be more anonymous in an online environment, which might encourage students who are a bit shy in the classroom to feel like they can actually have a voice in these online environments.
Sure, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question, which I think I would perhaps pick out a few teachers in the chat have talked about time limitations, where they have a lot of content that they want to get through in their lesson plan, thinking about how to and when to make sure that they have lots of opportunities for assessment for learning in their lesson plans. Do you have any advice about that, Karen?
Yeah, going back to the hinge questions, so you'll actually find Dylan William, who I spoke about with the framework. He has some YouTube videos on hinge questions, and he advocates that these should be really quick. So it shouldn't be that these sorts of activities take up huge amounts of time necessarily for hinge questions. The whole point was that they're quick so that you can decide what to do next. I would say, I know there is a tension because we have a lot of content, but sometimes it can be really difficult because you think, well, they haven't got this, but I've still got this content. But do you think if they don't understand one concept and one aspect, is that going to be difficult if it's a foundation for something later? So would it be worth spending a bit more time on a particular area so that the students really do get it, so that when you come to a related point later on, they actually have that secure foundation? But also, rather than thinking about you having to deliver content, when can students also actively construct their own understanding as well? So through active learning, could students find things out for themselves rather than you having to deliver content? And then you can embed peer assessment into that. So if students did a presentation, or they don't have to present to the whole class where you have every single group presenting, but they could just present in pairs to one another. So there are different ways in which you can embed it in a way that is, you kind of doesn't even really become assessment for learning anymore. It is actually just part of your teaching and your lessons, and it all just becomes your teaching practice in a way that supports your learners to construct understanding themselves and to receive feedback as efficiently as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. I'm afraid that that's all we have time for today, everybody. We really hope that you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you all for your questions, and apologies if we didn't get around to answering yours. Thank you also to Karen for taking the time to be with us today. As we said earlier, we will also be uploading a recording of this session to YouTube. We really hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.